Good day everyone, we are the fourth reporter and for today we will be going to discuss about the breaches in obligation of topic 4 which is nature and effect of obligation. But before we start, we will be going to introduce ourselves first. So I am Diana Rose Bayang together with Miss Althea Agbalog, Jenny Godoy, Jessa Marsan, Lucy Tan, Ravel Bayudan, and Valerie Wan from BSHM 3B. So what is Article 1170? Those who in the performance of their obligation are guilty of fraud, negligence, or delay, and those who in any manner contravene the tenor thereof are liable for damages. So, sinasabi dito sa Article 1170, pwede humingi ng damages to obligee kapag nalaman niya na guilty sa obliger for fraud, negligence, delay, o kaya merong hindi nasunod na napag-usapan. So, the question is, when is obliger liable for damages? First one, if he or she is guilty for fraud. So, example, may nagbebenta ng TV. Sabi na nagbebenta ng TV is touchscreen daw yung TV, pero hindi naman yun touchscreen. So, binili mo yun kasi naniwala ka na touchscreen yun. So, yung nagbebenta is nanluloko para lang makapagbenta siya ng mga products niya. So, that is fraud. The second one is negligence. Example, you are a janitor. Nagmamap ka pero nakalimutan mong maglagay ng sign na basa yung sahig, so may nadulas. That is negligence, meaning carelessness or kapabayaan. Dahil sa kapabayaan mo is may napapahamak na ibang tao. So, that is negligence. Third one is delay. So, that is self-explanatory naman, but I still cite some example. New Year's Eve, nagbebenta kayo ng mga pang medianoche. Pero, dineliver niyo yung orders nila January 1 na ng umaga. So, delay. And the last one is contravention of the tenor of the obligation. So, example, A is an engineer. Then there's B who wants to build a house, so he contacted A. So A signed a contract that he needed to build a 2 stories house for B. The house that A built for B is hindi nagustuhan ni B kasi sabi sa contract kailangan 2 stories lang. Pero yung ginawa ni A is 3 stories. So A is guilty for contravention of the tenor of the obligation. So si A is now liable for damages. The above provision gives the 4 grounds for liability. Yung 4 grounds for liability is yung 4 na binanggit ko kanina, which may entitle the injured party to damages for all kinds of obligations mentioned in Article 1157. Here, the breach of obligation is voluntary. In Article 1174, it is involuntary. So, yung Article 1157 is about the law, contract, quasi-contract, act or omission punished by law, and quasi-delicts na natakil na ni ma'am noong makanakaraan. Fraud. As used in Article 1170, it is the deliberate or intentional evasion of the normal fulfillment of an obligation. It is synonymous to bad faith in that it involves a design to mislead or deceive another. So, fraud in simple word is panloloko or pandaraya. So, under Article 1170, this actually refers to the fraud committed by the debtor at the time of the performance of his obligation. So, there are 2 kinds of fraud in general. First one is fraud according to meaning, and the second one is fraud according to time of commission. So, first, let's tackle about the fraud according to meaning. So, fraud in obtaining consent, causal fraud or dolo causante. So, causal fraud or dolo causante refers to fraud without which consent would not have been given, renders the contract voidable. So, voidable meaning valid until annulled. So, causal fraud or dolo causante, ito yung reason kung bakit nag-enter sa contract yung other party. So, example, A sell his iPhone Pro Max to B. A said that his phone is brand new and legitimate. Sabi niya na ibebenta niya yung phone sa kanya at a lower price, so si B, binili nga yung iPhone Pro Max ni A. The representation of A were all false kasi unang-una, that phone is not brand new kasi ninakaw lang yun ni A. So, the fraud employed by A is causal fraud. Kung wala sana yung fraud, hindi sana binili ni B yung cellphone. So, this contract is voidable. So, the remedy is B will file a case of annulment of contract. Second is incidental fraud or dolo incidente. Incidental fraud or dolo incidente refers to fraud without which consent would not have still been given, but the person giving it would have agreed on different terms. The contract is valid, but the party employing it shall be liable for damages. So, incidental fraud, kahit wala tong fraud na ito, magbibigay pa rin ng consent yung other party. The contract is voidable. So, example, A hired B to become a manager for his restaurant. B places in his application that he is a college graduate in BSHM kahit hindi naman. A will still hire B kahit sinabi niya sa application niya na hindi siya college graduate, kaso yung position niya is mababa. The fraud committed by B was incidental fraud kasi the contract can still exist kahit walang panloloko, unlike causal fraud na kaya lang na-exist yung contract is because of the panloloko na sinabi ng other party. So, B shall be liable to pay for damages. Next is fraud in the performance of the obligation. So, the meaning of this is the deliberate of act evading fulfillment of an obligation in a normal manner. This presupposes an existing obligation. Hence, the fraud has no effect on the validity of the contract since it was employed after perfection. However, the party employing it shall be liable for damages according to Article 1170. So, fraud in the performance of the obligation, ito na yung fraud na sinasabi sa Article 1170. The contract ay valid, but the one who commit the fraud shall be liable to pay for damages. So, example, A ordered 10 bottles of vinegar to B. A trust B kasi last time bumili sila ng suka sa kanila ay nasatisfy sila kasi masarap yung suka nila. B delivered 10 bottles of vinegars which she mixed with water para magmukhang madami yung laman ng suka. So, we are now here in fraud according to time of commission. The first one is future fraud. So, a waiver of an action for future fraud cannot be made. If there is an agreement for its waiver, the same is void. Thus, the debtor will still be liable for damages if he commits fraud in the performance of his obligation despite any waiver made by his creditor. So, future fraud, kung merong agreement yung parties na kung saan yung isang party hindi magiging liable na magbayad ng damages in case mag-commit siya ng fraud in the future. Yung agreement nila ay hindi valid, meaning their agreement has no legal effect. That's why the debtor will still pay for damages if he commits fraud in the future. So, example, A and B entered a contract. They agreed that if A will commit a fraud in the future, A will not be liable to pay for damages. But according to law, A will still liable to pay for damages. And second one is past fraud. Past fraud, a waiver of an action for past fraud may be made since the commission of fraud can no longer be encouraged. Such waiver is an act of liberty on the part of the creditor. So, fraud committed in the past, so pwedeng i-waive ng creditor ang kanyang right para makapag-receive ng damages. Kung winave ng creditor ang kanyang right para makapag-receive ng damages, hindi na liable na magbayad ng damages ang debtor. So, let us differentiate fraud and negligence. So, let's start from this Spanish term, dolo and culpa. Dolo or deceit, it is an act with deliberate intent. It has intention, so basically, fraud is dolo. On the other hand, culpa means fault. It is a wrongful act result from imprudence, negligence, or lack of skill. In simple word is kapabayaan or pagkakamali. So, first, it says here that fraud, deliberate intent to cause damage or injury to another, while in negligence, lack of insufficiency of diligence required in a given situation. So, gaya ng sabi ko kanina, fraud is intentionally, while in negligence is unintentionally. So the second one is fraud liability cannot be mitigated by the court, while in negligence, liability can be mitigated by the court. So, mitigated means mababawasan. So, fraud, hindi siya pwedeng mabawasan sa korte. While in negligence, can be mitigated but it depends on the situation or kung gaano kabigat yung sitwasyon. And last is fraud. Waiver of action for future fraud is void, while in negligence, waiver of action for future negligence may be valid. So, waiver of action means isa-set aside mo yung right mo para kasuhan yung tao dahil may fraud siyang ginawa. Gaya ng sabi ko kanina, yung contract na nagsasabi na in case mag-commit ako ng fraud in the future is hindi mo ako pwede kasuhan. Yun ay bawal po. But in the past, fraud is pwede. At pwedeng huwag mo na siyang kasuhan at papatawarin mo na lang. When it comes to negligence naman, pwedeng gawing provision yun, but it depends on the circumstances naman. When is negligence equivalent to fraud? Masasabi nating negligence equivalent to fraud kapag meron itong gross negligence. So, what is gross negligence? It is defined as carelessness which is in reckless disregard for the safety or lives of others and is so great it appears to be a conscious violation of others people's right to safety. It is more than simple inattention, but it is just shy of being intentionally evil. So, I'll cite some real-life situation example. In the Sewol Ferry tragedy of South Korea, yung mga 300 plus na pasahero and mostly student yung namatay dahil sa tragedy na ito. So, ni-renovate nila yung barko. Mas pinalaki nila para mas madaming maisakay na pasahero at mas madami yung magiging income nila. So, 200 tons were added in the Sewol Ferry which is lumagpas sa maximum limit kaya lumubog yung barko. Kung hindi sana nila ginawa yung renovation na iyon, hindi sana mangyayari yung aksidente and sana mas inalam muna nila yung maximum limit ng barko. So, in that situation, there is no intent to cause injury but intent to cause the action that resulted in the injury. Negligence or fault or culpa is any voluntary act or omission, there being no malice, which prevent the normal fulfillment of an obligation. It refers to when one party is being careless or neglectful or does not apply the proper expertise to the act within the contract. So for example of this is a driver who runs a stop causing an injury crash. So, bakit nagkaroon ng negligence ang driver? It because, alam na nga ng driver na na-stop yung sign, but still, dinediretso niya yung daan. So, there is a contract between the driver and the owner of the taxi na dapat is mag-drive siya ng safety para may send yung passenger in her destination na safety. So, nagkakaroon ng negligence if yung contract between two parties is napabayaan ng isang party or merong careless na nagawa or being neglectful. So, kasi ang tinatawag nating negligence in Tagalog is kapabayaan. So, another example, para maintindihan pa natin, is a store owner who fails to put up a caution wet floor sign after mopping up a spill. So, bakit nagkaroon ng kapabayaan ang store owner? It because, if ever man, example sa Jollibee, if may natapon na water or drinks in the area wherein maraming customer or dumadaan na customer. And then, after niyang minap is hindi niya nilagyan ng cushion na wet floor in which maraming customer na dumadaan and then there is one customer na dumaan and then na-fall siya or naipagaliso na. So, sino takin-basol? So, ni store owner. Kasi, hananaikan iti or nalipatan na nga inikan iti caution nga wet floor. Kat obligation na DJ nga mangipan after na nga imap. So, kung napabayaan yung obligation mo or hindi mo ginawa ng obligation mo and then it causes pain or injury of the other party and then yun yung tinatawag nating negligence or fault or culpa. According to Supreme Court, it is the failure to observe for the protection of the interests of another person that degree of care, precautions, or vigilance if the circumstances is justly demanded by the person suffered by injury or pain. So, nagkaroon ng kapabayaan or negligence if the person is failed to observe the protection of the interests of another person in which it causes pain or injury of the other party. So, yung example natin kanina na a car crash, a driver who runs a stop causing an injury crash. So, bakit ba nagkaroon ng injury crash? It because yung driver is dinediretso-diretso niya yung daan na mayroon naman signal na stop. So, bakit yung may signal na stop? Hindi niya iniisip na may accident na mangyayari or injury crash or car crash if diretso-diretso niya yung daan. So, hindi niya sinunod yung contract or the rules in the road na pag may signal na stop is you should stop also. So, in negligence, para hindi ka ng negligence is you should follow the law prescribed and you should follow the ordinary negligence or ordinary diligence. There is 3 elements of negligence. First is duty to perform or duty on the part of the defendant to protect the plaintiff from injury of which the latter contains. So, sinasabi niya dito na you should have a duty to protect the plaintiff against injury or pain. So, paano mo maprotektahan yung plaintiff against injury and pain? So, you should follow the rules, you should follow the contracts, you should follow the law prescribed, and then you should follow the ordinary diligence para maiwasan yung pain and injury of the other party. So, next element is the failure to perform such duty. So, failure to perform such duty, if there is a failure to perform such duty, and then there is an injury or pain of the other party, and that is the third element, which is an injury to the plaintiff through such failure. So, in the first place, or in the first element, that it said that you have the duty to protect the plaintiff against injury and pain. So, in the number 1 element, dapat is kailangan mo nang sundin yung contract. You should follow the contract, you should follow the law para hindi ka magkaroon ng failure to perform such duty. For example, Pablo is a passenger in a taxi. So, here, there is considered a contract of carriage between Paulo and the owner of the taxi company. So, in consideration of the fare to the paid by Paulo, so the owner of the taxi company, through the driver, agrees to safely bring Paulo to his destination. So, if recklessness of the driver, like for example, driving at an unjustified rate of speed or entering a way street, an accident occurs as result of which Paulo is injured, there is negligence which would make the owner liable for damages. So, if the taxi contained defective parts, the failure to repair the same constitute also negligence on the part of the owner. So, in this example, so Pablo is a passenger. So, there is a contract between Paulo and the owner of the taxi company. So, ano yung contract nila? So, ang contract nila is, syempre, magbabayad naman si Paulo ng fare or flete na. So, dapat is, yung para kay Paulo naman is, dapat maihatid siya sa kanyang destination na safety. Safety. So, if the driver didn't follow the contract between the company owner and Paulo, and then nagkaroon ng recklessness of the driver like driving unjustified rate, and then nadisgrasya suda, and then sino iti liable for such damages? Siyempre ni taxi company owner. Bakit? Bakit hindi si driver? Kasi si company owner is shoulder nga si driver. So, kahit na si driver yung nagkamali, and then si owner pa rin yung masisisi. It's because yung contract is between the owner of the taxi company and any passenger. So, kahit na kahit na yung taxi na ginamit is sira-sira na dahil sa disgrasya, si owner pa rin yung mag-shoulder ng damages. In determining the issue of negligence, the following factors must be considered. So, you should consider the following factors. So, first factor is nature of the obligation. So, example of this is smoking while carrying materials known to be inflammable constitute negligence. So, alam mo na nga na flammable yung hawak mo, and then nagsisigarilyo ka pa. So, sino yung masisisi? Siyempre, ikaw. Kasi alam mo na nga inflammable yung hawak mo, and then bakit ka pa magsisigarilyo, di ba? Meron ka na nga obligation. Pero, bakit hindi mo pa kayang gawin? So, yan yung tinatawag nating nature of obligation. So, another example is also, yung driver who runs a stop causing an injury crash. So, alam na nga ng driver na stop yung sign. So, bakit pa niya dinediretso yung daan, di ba? Meron siyang obligation to follow the rules, to follow the road rules, the law. So, bakit niya pa rin dinediretso yung daan if stop? So, you should stop if the sign is stop. Yun yung tinatawag niyang nature of the obligation. So, next factor is we have circumstances of the person. So, example of this is a guard. A man in the prime of life, robust and healthy, sleeping while on duty is guilty of negligence. Siyempre, circumstances of the person. So, siyempre, if you are a guard, so you should protect. If night shift ka, example, night shift ka, pagubraan, guard ka. Kaya siyempre, you should protect the
company or the area. And then, bakit ka natutulog? So, you should sleep in the morning. And then, pag nag-duty ka na, syempre, hindi ka na makakatulog. So, upon your duty, dapat is you should awake 8 hours or 8 hours, hindi. Depende sa oras ng duty mo. So, meron kang obligation na gawin kasi nga nagtatrabaho ka. So, what if maturog ka gayam ket ada gayam tinapan simrek ije kaslang umambang ko ta bambantaya mon ket ada iti simrek nga di mo napuputan kasi maturog ka. So, sino nga akimbasol? Syempre, sika kasi sika ti mangbambantay deta. Sika ti ada dita. So, sikat guard. So, ano silbi ba ti guard? Syempre, kat protektahan na DJ pambantayan na no either man no bangko data or any company, diba? So, di mang ko damages, syempre ni guard. Next factor is the circumstances of time. So, example is driving a car without headlights at night is gross negligence. But it does not by itself constitute negligence when during the day. Siyempre, pag rabi, di ba? Kailangan mo't nga agsilaw, tapnon hang ka madisgrasya or tapnon makita na ka DJ kasi nabat mo. So nga, kailangan adati headlight data motor mo no labi. Siyempre, no bigat. Alangan naman no naka-on data headlight data motor mo no bigat. No bigat, siyempre, hang ka nga magkaroon ti negligence. Kasi nga bigat, maliwanag. Ngayon no labi, tapos hang ka nakasilaw, syempre, di ba, nasunod, tas hang ka nakasilaw. What if adagayang pasinabat mo, pada kayo ngawan silaw na. Syempre, tapos nakapatpataray kayo. Syempre, no, kapag awan silaw, yuhan yung nakita ti may sakin may siya. May sakin may sa, and then nagdinong par kayo. Syempre, no rabi, di ba, kailangan mo't nga agsilaw, tapnon hang ka madisgrasya, or tapnon makita na ka DJ kasi nabat mo. So nga, kailangan adati headlight data motor mo no labi. Siyempre, no bigat. Alangan naman no naka-on data headlight data motor mo no bigat. No bigat, siyempre, hang ka nga magkaroon ti negligence. Kasi nga bigat, maliwanag. Ngayon no labi, tapos hang ka nakasilaw, syempre, di ba, nasunod, tas hang ka nakasilaw. What if adagayang pasinabat mo, pada kayo ngawan silaw na. Syempre, tapos nakapatpataray kayo. Syempre, no, kapag awan silaw, yuhan yung nakita ti may sakin may siya. May sakin may sa, and then nagdinong par kayo. Syempre, basol yun di jay. Kasi nga, rabi syempre, kailangan mo ti silaw ti pagnaam. O na ibagbagaman nga the street light ko na. Siyempre, no, ada motor mo, kailangan mo nga ada silaw na no rabi kasi talaga obligation mo di chay. Next factor is circumstances of the place. So, example is driving at 100 km per hour on the superhighway is permissible, but driving at the same rate speed in Rizal Street is gross recklessness. Bakit? Kasi, di ba, pag superhighway, syempre, diretso deta, highway nga rod. Aman iti, tapos nalawat daan. Syempre, unay man pa napataray ka, diretso met, han mo permissible di jay. Han nga magkaroon ti negligence. Pero pag napataray ka, the same rate, tapos ada ka iti iti liko-liko nga daan or iti crossing. Syempre, no napataray ka, tapos deta pinapataray mo, hanga nakita deta kasi nabat mo, ket nagdinumpar kayo, syempre, sino iti akin ba? So, syempre, sika. So, dapat is know your place, your time, person, and your obligation para hindi ka magkaroon ng negligence, para hindi ka makagawa ng kapabayaan. So, ito lang yung dapat natin tandaan, factors to be considered in negligence. So, first is the obligation. So, you should follow the obligation between your contracts. Next is the person itself. So, you should, dapat is pag naka-duty ka, dapat is you followed your obligation na naka-duty, hindi yung patulog-tulog lamang para hindi ka pasukan ng magnanakaw. And then next is time. Syempre, dapat iyanamot tay time mo, time. Syempre, kasla ka DJ, example tatay na nurabi, kailangan silaw na nakamotor ka, nabigat, hanggang magkaroon negligence kasi nga, because bigat, naliwanag, han ka madisgrasya, no uray mo pa'y nakasilaw ka, nga bigbigat, man. Next is place. Syempre, no highway data. Syempre, if highway or super highway, sabi niya super highway, tay talaga nga nalawang nga daanan kinaatid to nga naatid nga highway. Syempre, uri man pa'y patarayan de talugan mo in 100 km/h, it is permissible, accepted, kasi nga super highway. Pero no yung 100 km/h nga itarikas lang, example, Rizal Street, syempre, hanga permissible. Kasi nga, na-elected. Example, merong naman crossing, merong mga crossing, syempre, dapat is i-lower mo tayo speed mo. Ukwa. Hanga DJ 100 km/h, hangkas lang DJ no hangkas lang nga super highway ko. Sige lang. So, know your place. So, yun lamang yung mga factors to be considered in negligence.